Hi, this is Lisa Henderson, editor for Applied Clinical Trials, and I'm here today with Kate Trainor, Vice President and Global Head of Project Leadership and Technology for the Peri-Approval Clinical Excellence, or PACE group at Parexel. Hi, Kate. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good. So we were going to talk about electronic health or medical records. Is there a particular term that you prefer? Is it EHR, EMR?
We use EHR here in Parexel.
Okay.
So they are used interchangeably in industry oftentimes.
Right. But there is no specific difference between the two, right?
Well, I think one is meant to be the electronic health records are the actual records that can be used in an EMR system in one definition.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk about that today and the uses in clinical trials, because we have heard a lot about the uses for electronic health records and some actual case studies. So what do you see as the biggest areas for potential for EHR use in clinical trials?
I think there are some key areas that really present the greatest opportunities for clinical research. First off, it's protocol feasibility evaluation. We'd like to leverage the electronic clinical data within these systems to evaluate the protocol computationals, for example, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, to validate that the patients exist with those criteria in reality, or modify the protocol to make sure they have the ability to find patients. Some of the other areas would be actual patient recruitment. We'd like to be able to actually detect patients that are eligible for trials and observational research. Of course, either of these areas require that you have the data in data standards formats and fashion, and that each of the data sets has the appropriate representation of regions. You know, for example, the different geographic regions are covered, North America, Europe, Latin America, Asia Pac, to make sure that they're actually addressing the targeted areas, as well as, of course, having the right contents for the therapeutic area under research. You know, and this is very hard, right? These are two of these areas actually contain some of our biggest challenges, which is, you know, being able to find all of that data in one system. Quite often you try to standardize that, but it exists in disparate systems today with different data standards. So that is a big challenge. There's one other area that presents a pretty big potential for use of EHR, and that is being able to actually use the data for a retrospective or a prospective study. And if you have the ability to extract the information and potentially preload an EDC or actually just include it into a data set, you have the ability to actually use that data as part of an overall study. But being able to extract that data and map it to data systems or EDC data elements is very difficult.
You know, when I think of EHR, of course, a meaningful use, that's very U.S.-centric, and the physicians adopting it in our country and everything. But you mentioned global regions. So is it easier to do some of this data mapping and extraction in other countries where they might have that all in one area, for example, in the U.K.?
Not yet. I think you're definitely pointing out some things that are very important, and that is that different nations are at different places in terms of their electronic health record adoption. So we know the U.S. has incentives out there to be able to get physicians to adopt faster. We also know that many of the Scandinavian countries have a very strong lead in using EHR systems. And as you mentioned, the U.K., the issue is that different countries are at different levels of use. So the first thing to be able to get a global consideration of what is truly the status for a global study is to try to equalize. And that's one of the things that I think is a barrier to use overall, is we have to use subsets of data. You know, we can represent one geography or another, but not quite yet until global immersion has taken place can we represent for an entire global study what the status is.
So then do you have a sense of when that global immersion could actually be achieved?
That's a great question. I think we do think that over the next 3 to 5 years, we're seeing that there will be more saturation with the different systems. However, there's also going to be some churn in the technology platform. Some of the different vendors may actually turn out not to be viable. We know that this has already taken place, and the sites have had to change their EMR systems because they have found difficulties working with a vendor. They might have a lack of customer support, inefficient or unsupported software, inability to actually meet the meaningful use criteria here in the U.S. Those things will cause churn within the technology platform. So I think the first step will be about 3 to 5 years of changes within some of the vendor space, and then probably another couple years until they actually standardize some of the modeling that's required for an EHR vendor. And when I speak to the modeling, I'm referring to their ability to accept queries, the protocol queries that I mentioned, the patient queries, the other information, and be able to have a business model that allows them to process that query, be able to deliver data in a meaningful way, and be able to turn those things around quickly, such as the eClinical community will require. It'll take a while, so I think it's 3 to 5 years until the EHR vendors are more stabilized and standardized, and then a couple more years until the business models actually stabilize as well. I think it's probably at least 5 to 7 years in total for probably the U.S., North America, and Europe, and maybe a decade to get to some additional regions.
Do you know of case studies or successes that you would point to where EHR has been used successfully in clinical trials?
We do have some case studies primarily for the protocol feasibility and recruitment criteria. We're still working on how to do the observational research extracts.
Mm-hmm.
So that is something, it's very simple if you're looking at something like a chart review completely retrospective. And it would be very similar to a manual chart review where you're simply using an electronic system and reviewing through the data. But being able to load to an EDC system, that has been done a couple times in sample format as far as I know. I think that there are now starting to be early adopters in the actual conduct of observational research, whether it be retrospective or even prospective, which could potentially be an RCT as well, randomized clinical trial, and they can actually collect some of the data as you go forward in the CRFs for the EDC system, where some of the data would be automatically populated and other would be added via, normal patient visits, et cetera. We do know that there are attempts to do that today. I don't believe it's been done in practice yet in a real study, though we've seen demonstrations of the capabilities. I think the early adopters are looking forward to being able to do that. I think the difficulty comes in when you're running a larger study and you have to be able to get data from more than one source. We know that these sources are in different data formats and there are different business models for the different EMR and EHR vendors. It takes an awful lot of work to be able to standardize that.
So you think there's going to be, and I'm speaking specifically about the United States right now, do you think there's going to be a lot of shakeout in the EHR vendor space?
Right, I think so. I don't know if I'd call it shakeout, but certainly churn. Absolutely, right? We know that the starting for the vendors is actually to get into the physician's office to be able to collect the data as they're treating patients. The secondary element is the use for eClinical research. And we know that the physician population is very different as well, right? They don't all necessarily want to participate in the commercial aspects of eClinical research.
Right.
So, the EMR vendors, I think, are trying to become the installed system of choice initially, and then are going to be working towards the eClinical research component. But today, there's a staggering number. Today, there's at least 500 different systems today, right? And I think that's an incredibly high number, whether those are commercially available or free. That's a very high number for any data standard to try to work with. So I do think there's going to be a lot of churn with the platforms and data standards that these different technologies will have to adhere to, to make it more usable in large-scale global studies. If we were just going to go to another point is the biggest challenge. We've talked about this a little bit, and I think it's the fact that there are many EHR vendors in the marketplace today. They have considerable differences in data structures, business viability, and eClinical research capabilities. I think making sure that we can get to those standards, and there are a number of different initiatives going on today to drive to those standards, that's going to be able to help us to get to that stable technology platform. Being able to manage the data and the integrations of the data is critical for use for e-research purposes.
Well, thank you for your time, Kate. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Lisa.